Tim, we've talked about how one of the hallmarks of the 80s is the kind of transition from post-punk music to something more kind of sophisticated, a bit more glammy. But there are still a lot of the bands from the punk era still kind of, working in those waters. Let's talk about some of them first. First of all, we have to talk about, I think, one of the greatest post-punk albums ever, possibly one of the most depressing, claustrophobic, you know what I'm going to talk about now, don't you? One of the most depressing, claustrophobic and nihilistic albums ever made, certainly ever made by a mainstream charting act. I'm talking about, of course,
Agadoo. You're talking about Pornography by The Cure.
Pornography by The Cure. What an album. Now, I used to make a joke on stage. I used to say, obviously I'm not known for my fun lyrics, but then I used to say, what do you expect from someone who grew up listening to The Cure's Pornography, where the first line on the album is...
Isn't it, what's it matter if we all die? Something black falls out of your mouth and we laugh.
What a great way to start our record.
That is it, isn't it?
Does it matter if we all... Yeah. I mean, that kind of... It doesn't get any brighter from there on in, does it really? Let's face it. The title track being one of the most claustrophobic pieces of music I've ever heard in my life.
Well, the whole album is relentless.
It's relentless. I love it.
It's great.
I mean, absolutely. Now, the funny thing is, of course, from this point on, there was no way they could go further in that direction. So they actually went in the complete opposite direction, which is one of the wonderful things about The Cure, isn't it? That they could have basically stopped here, and they would have been this... Probably along with the Joy Division catalogue, it would have become this kind of, little catalogue crystallised in time, nihilistic, sort of black anorak, indie kids' favourites. And of course, they went off and wrote Let's Go to Bed and Close to You and Friday I'm in Love. And completely reinvented themselves as
Love Cats.
Quite a joyous pop band.
Yeah.
But I keep coming back to the trilogy, the nihilistic, depressing, claustrophobic trilogy. 17 Seconds, Faith, and none more depressing than
I come back to that, and then I come back to things like Disintegration as well as a personal favourite. I love them. The trilogy is great, and it's almost like, because the first album is almost like, there are a couple of great tracks on it, but the first album, which I don't think the band were fully behind, is a total outlier.
Seems like a false start.
They begin on 17 Seconds.
Yeah.
And Faith takes it that bit further, goes into grey, dim areas. Pornography is that blackened to an extreme extent. My favourite is still 17 Seconds, which was the first Cure album I bought. But that trilogy, fantastic. And it is, how far can we go?
How dark can we get? Yeah. And also, I think the difference between Pornography and 17 Seconds and Faith is the drum sound. Again, they're using that different producer, Phil Thornley. They're using that kind of big, roomy drum sound, which just sucks all of the air out of the mix. Like on 17 Seconds of Faith, the drum sounds are very clipped, very small.
Yeah.
There's all this space. On Pornography, there's no space. Everything is claustrophobic. Everything sounds like it's sort of like taking up all of the sonic space. The vocals, the drums, the guitars, the keyboards. It's a massive, massive sounding record. It does feel like you're getting sucked into this maelstrom of negativity and nihilism. And sometimes that's exactly where I want to go.
Yeah. No, weirdly enough,
in fact.
I was asked to do another YouTube podcast in which it was about music that affects your mood, or music that in some ways relates to how you're feeling, and how it also relates to mental health. And I was saying that in the 80s, one of my go-to albums was Pornography, because if there was a certain mood I was feeling, a certain bleakness, Pornography was the perfect soundtrack to that. And it didn't plunge me deeper into despair. It was merely an echo of that despair. So it is one of my most played Cure albums. And it is something they never properly returned to. And you kind of wonder what Robert Smith's mindset was during this era.
You do. You worry for his mental health at this point, yeah.
Yeah. The drums are very different. So one of the big differences, as you say, I think on 17 Seconds, it's quite metronomic, almost at times like primitive drum machines in the background of these Spartan guitar lines. Faith is more amorphous. This is really dense and quite heavy tribal drumming throughout it as well.
Yeah, big rummy sounds. And also his voice. He's never sounded more demented than he does on this record. Some of the
Yeah.
treatments on the voice, I forget which the song is now, where he sings the line and then the echo repeats the line and then they start pitch shifting the echo. And there's all this vocal processing on the record. It's, we come back to this word time and time again, the sense of otherness this record has. This sense of the band could never recreate this, even if they tried. And I think there has been periods in time when they've tried to get back to the sort
Yeah.
of sound of the classic. I think Disintegration, in a way, was the first time they tried to get back to that melancholic feeling they captured on these three records. But there's something about the age they were, the time they were making the records, the technology that was available to them, the aesthetics of the sound of the time, the drum machines that were available to them, the production techniques that are available to them, that are kind of burned into the very fabric of these records.
Yeah.
That big tribal drum sound, we're hearing it on the Dreaming. We're hearing it on anything Steve Lillywhite produced. We're going to talk about it also on Siouxsie and the Banshees album. The English Settlement, the XTC album, that big roomy drum sound is kind of, that's the drum sound of choice of the day for a lot of bands.
But I also think what you've tapped into on this is something that the Associates and the Kate Bush have that not a lot of albums do during this year. And that is the otherness, the otherworldly quality. There is something, despite its darkness, quite spectral, quite demented, quite free, I find about this album, which a lot of records don't. The Gabriel, as we said, beautiful and powerful and dynamic.
Yeah.
It's not got the same sense of strangeness and otherness. I remember, I guess it was a description I remember that related to a Robert Wyatt album around the time it was in The Enemy. It was something like strangely beautiful and beautifully strange. And I think that that's something that kind of captures these albums as well, including Pornography.
I'm reminded I forget who it was now, but somebody was talking about The Exorcist, the film, and saying there's something evil in the very celluloid of that movie.
Yeah.
And there is something about albums like Pornography. I mean, I would sort of talk about Throbbing Gristle's second annual report in the same terms. There's something sick in the very essence of the music that even the band would find it difficult to understand exactly why it
Where it
sounds like it
comes
does,
from.
where it came from. I mean, they were still very young at the time. I think Robert Smith's like, 22, maybe 23. And it sounds like he was in a very dark place. And he's channeling that through the music, and he could never get back to that space ever again.
But they were big. I mean, the thing about The Cure is that almost from the off, they were getting a lot of press, a lot of sales. So even before the Love Cats era, this was a rated band that was selling decent sized venues.
Well, that's the funny thing, isn't it? If you think about this record came out the same year as Duran Duran's Rio. And about a year later, The Cure would have been in direct competition at the top of the charts, for joyous pop.
Yes.
And yet at this moment in time, you cannot imagine two more different records.
No.
And two more different aesthetics than The Cure's Pornography and Duran Duran on the beach with the supermodels on the yacht in the Bahamas making Rio. It's so far apart. And yet these records came out same year. That's a beautiful thing about music, isn't it? Let's talk. Oh, we've got a listener's review of Pornography. Let's hear what they make of Pornography, and it takes them to a place of sickness as well.
Hi, Stephen and Tim. How you guys doing? So 1982 is the year. I'm thinking Pornography by The Cure. This is such a landmark record for the whole goth, post-punk movement. Very dark, depressing record. 100,000 Years. That's one of the, most evilest guitar riffs ever written, in my opinion. The rest of the album's great as well. Hanging Garden, Figurehead, the title track. Very cool album. Hope you guys discuss about this one. I think it deserves your guys' opinions. I'll be listening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, as you heard, we absolutely love this record. We love it too. So we're on the same page there. Let's talk about XTC's English Settlement. I hear many people talking about English Settlement as the kind of pinnacle of XTC's catalogue. I've never quite felt that way myself. I love all XTC albums. I'm kind of an apologist for the band in that sense. I love them all, for their own reasons. English Settlement to me always felt something about slightly unfinished.
I totally agree.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, never. I mean, I know that this is seen as a bit of a holy grail.
Yeah.
And I loved XTC from the very early singles. Again, I was buying them early on. Drums and Wires, what a razor-edged masterpiece
Black
that was.
Sea, yeah.
Black Sea, pop masterclass.
Mama that came after.
And I love Mama. As
Yeah.
you know, it's one of the albums that I think is unfairly neglected. I'd even go as far as, obviously we know Skylarking, but Big Express I think is great.
Very much
This
unfairly.
is my least favourite of
Me too.
all
And I
the early
still
albums.
like it. Don't get me wrong.
No,
Still like it.
Really
It's
good album.
amazing songs on it.
Do you know what I think? For me, okay, two things. One, it's overlong. This is a double album that extends its welcome. And two, because they're such a creative, playful, tonally adventurous band. In my mind, and I might be being really unfair to it, this is a fairly samey sounding
No, I think you're
album.
right. I agree. It's almost, that's what I mean by it sounds almost unfinished. It almost feels like XTC. They haven't brought that final level of arrangement detail to some of them. Some of the tracks like Leisure, Down in the Cockpit, Knuckle Down. They're almost too simplistic for XTC in my mind, compared to things that were on Black Sea, like No Language in Our Lungs, Roads Go to the Globe from Drums and Wires, and then from tracks from Mama, some of the classic tracks from Mama, like Love on a Farm by Zwidgy. There isn't that degree of sophistication in the production to me. Now, I don't know if it's something to do with Hugh Padgham. It's the only album he ever produced on his own for XTC. And he was on the cusp of becoming in fact, he may already have been the producer of choice of Phil Collins and The Police. And it feels like the album just doesn't have the same amount of sophistication. Some of the songs are brilliant. Mm-hmm. Some of the songs feel like those classic, if it had been a single album, those songs would have been relegated to B-side kind of songs. Some of the ones I mentioned before. But at the same time, since he's working overtime, Jason and the Argonauts, Fly on the Wall, Melt the Guns, brilliant tracks. Snowman, brilliant tracks. English Roundabout, brilliant tracks.
And also it fits in my Academy of the Underrated in that if this was their only album,
sure.
we'd be talking about what a genius album it is
Yeah.
by a long lost band. So there's quality there. It's just in relation to what precedes and what follows. And it comes back to me with something you used to say about, I think, XTC, possibly ELO and 10cc, maybe Beatles even, that each song had its own distinct sound world. They created these pieces, out of the blue. I remember you talking about this.
Yeah.
10cc definitely did it. And I think XTC did. You listen to
Completely.
Black Sea, you listen to Skylarking.
Yeah.
Every song has its own
It's
world.
it's like, what are the lyrics about?
Yeah.
Now let's create a sound world that fits in with that. Andy's very, very big on the music reflecting the lyrics.
This less so. This is
I agree.
It's almost like, and it's going to sound worse than I intend it to, an XTC Demos album.
I really like the record, but for me, and the one thing I hate is when people say, about double albums, oh, it would have made a great single album. No! But this is the one occasion when I'm going to get against my rule. I could make an amazing single album from the best tracks in English. No Thugs in Our House, Yacht Dance. I could put together like 8 or 9 tracks that for me would be an amazing. But as an album, 15 songs, however many is on there, 15 or 16 songs, I think, it's overlong. Too many of the tracks feel like they were left in a state they wouldn't normally have left them. But it's still a great album.
Last album with Terry Chambers, isn't it, this one?
Last album with Terry Chambers, yeah. He's on. He plays on a couple of tracks on Mama, yeah. But yeah.
Okay. But yeah, Hymns to the Silence is another one which we both agree that Van Morrison later, but you could make a great single album out of what is quite a flabby double.
And normally, as I say, I don't like it when people say that, because for me, sometimes double albums, the sprawl is what makes them unique in the catalogue. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this is an album where I feel like I would probably cherry pick my favourite tracks and contradict my own rules there. Let's move on. Siouxsie and the Banshees, A Kiss in the Dreamhouse. I've never been a big fan of Siouxsie and the Banshees. I love the idea of Siouxsie and the Banshees. Do you know this record, Tim? Is this the one with Robert Smith on guitar? Or is that one of the...
Oh, God, it might be. I'm trying to think. It might well be. I mean, I knew and loved, because Siouxsie, again, I bought the early singles, loved them. And then I thought Kaleidoscope as an album. Actually, the first 2 albums are great, saying that. But Kaleidoscope was the first album I bought as it came out. Adored the singles. And I think there's what I love about that is there's a nagging quality to the hooks, there's an intensity, and there's a leanness to the production that I really quite like. And around this time, I think slightly before, there was a single that's one of my favourite Siouxsie and the Banshees singles, Israel,
Israel, yeah.
which I think is
It's a
stunning.
non-album single, yeah.
Yeah.
I do love that.
And
Yeah.
the singles collection, I think it was Once Upon a Time, I
Yeah,
thought
that's really
was
good. Yeah.
indispensable.
So we're doing Alan Partridge again here, aren't we? What's your favourite Siouxsie and the Banshees album? I'd have to say the best of Siouxsie and the Banshees. But there is a sense that that is the case for me anyway, as more of a dabbler in the catalogue.
Yeah, Kiss
Not-
and the
not so
Dreamhouse.
familiar with
I remember just, and still it's the same. I've listened to it. I like the sound of it. I like the ambition. They're going in a more slightly tribal, but also symphonic direction. But I always remember feeling this was a little bit more bloated than I want it to be. And that's my fault in some ways. But, I love some of the later stuff, Cities and Dust, where they're apparently in decline, or, others. So I still think they continue to be a very interesting band with very interesting individual players, like The Police, like Japan, people like Severin, Budgie. They were
Yeah,
great, actually.
yeah.
And obviously they had a procession of really interesting guitarists.
I mean, did they? Correct me if I'm wrong. As I say, my knowledge is not that great about the catalogue. Didn't they follow this with a covers album, Through the Looking Glass, which to me is always a sign of a little bit of a creative impasse. Do you know what I mean?
It's certainly.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a little later, but
Maybe it
yeah,
was later,
It's that.
yeah.
I mean, they did a double live album,
Right. Okay.
which again is for me
Another
was a sign
sign
of
of
a creative impasse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about a band that at this time you could say had a very, very strong Siouxsie influence, the Banshees influence. Cocteau's, their first album, the Cocteau Twins' first album, Garlands, in some cases wears its Siouxsie and the Banshees influences very obviously on its sleeve, doesn't it? And again, this is a little bit of a false start for them. Very soon they were going to develop into something much more special, like almost like a butterfly growing out of the pupa in a sense. Here they're still kind of a little bit tied towards their post-punk roots. They're very young, aren't they? I think Liz is like 18 years old or something on this. One of the great voices of all time, surely Liz Fraser. But here she's really channeling Siouxsie, isn't she?
I like it. I mean, it's funny because I've just been slightly critical of Kiss in the Dreamhouse. Again, which is more my memory. I didn't listen to it again to refresh, so I might be entirely wrong. But my view was that whereas Kaleidoscope hit a sweet spot for me as an albums band, a singles band, Kiss in the Dreamhouse was just, as I've said, ever so slightly bloated. Whereas actually, Garlands, I love the razor edge intensity. Clearly, they've got almost one influence, and it's Siouxsie and the Banshees.
Well, I think it's also the drum machine. I love
But the drum machine gives
on
it, gives it a unique
DIY,
quality.
Yeah, DIY. But again, the bedroom thing.
But you really feel like they needed to make this music.
Yeah. It's good. I like it too. I like it too. The Birthday Party, Junkyard. Obviously, Nick Cave, famously Nick Cave's early band. I think he was in another band before this called the Boys Next Door. But Birthday Party was like the band that kind of brought him to the international stage. I wasn't so familiar with the Birthday Party. I've got one EP which I quite like. As you know from previous episodes, if you've heard me talking about Nick Cave, I'm not the biggest fan of Nick Cave, and I've always found that to be pretty much my problem because I know he's amazing. There's something remarkable about the Birthday Party. It's kind of unhinged, punky. It's almost like blues music, but played with a sort of punky. We've used this word a few times on the show already. The kind of like frenetic abandon, demented abandon. It's a punk rock approach to swampy blues, isn't it? In a way, Birthday Party, and he is possessed on it. He's possessed. He's probably strung out on heroin at the time.
Probably.
Completely possessed.
I like this. I really love the guitar sound and the drum sound because, again, it actually has quite a big drum sound at times. The one track I always remember coming back to was She's Hit. Is that the one?
Right, I think so, yeah.
Really
Not so
powerful. There's a loose... I mean, what's interesting with them is that they use the kind of heavily gated production technique sometimes, but with a looseness of, as you say, a shambling indie blues band. And he's got this tremendous commanding voice. And weirdly, I hear aspects of that later on in the early Sugar Cubes. I think they had that kind of almost trash can indie quality that I hear in the Birthday Party, because again there's a sort of dissonance at times with the guitar.
It's very dissonant. It's very aggressive. It's unhinged. I mean, it is kind of on the edge of. It feels like it's on the edge of falling apart.
Yeah.
Most of the time, it feels like most of the tracks are live, capturing lightning in a bottle, capturing a live take, vocals and all. It's very punky, it's very bluesy, it's very arty as well.
Well, without it being a favourite album for me, I was actually really struck by it because I heard it at the time because a friend was a huge fan. And it was one of those where I was arrested. You know, someone was like,
Yeah,
this is brilliant. There's something
yeah.
here. And while, I wouldn't put it in my top 10 of the year, it was definitely one of those albums that opened my ears to certain possibilities and certain aspects I wanted in my own music as well. That I heard this and I thought, Jesus, this is on fire.
Yeah. I
Which
think,
could be a title on the album, Jesus, This Is on Fire.
well, their first album was called Prayers on Fire,
Oh,
wasn't
was it? Yeah. There you
it?
go.
This is the second album. Yeah, I think there's a sense that there's been a lot of sort of drip down influence from this kind of stuff. I think bands like the John Spencer Blues
Yeah.
Explosion, those kind of bands. It's got almost that kind of aggressive, punky, arty art rock blues thing, which I like the idea of it. I think this is kind of paraphrasing what you're saying. I like the idea of it
Yeah.
more than I like the reality of listening to it. Let's talk about Bauhaus. The Sky's Gone Out. In some cases, Bauhaus. I mean, goth bands get accused of being very, they're easy to make fun of, aren't they? The goth scene is very easy to make fun of. Bauhaus, possibly more than any other band, elevated goth music to levels of pretension that are just off the scale. And this is their album, and I quite like that about them. The Sky's Gone Out. Now, they wear their influences on their sleeve. On this album, there's a cover of Third Uncle from the Eno album, which they do a very good version of, although no one can replicate Robert Fripp's guitar solo on the original. They do a very credible version. They also, around this time, release a non-album single of Ziggy Stardust, a very faithful version of Ziggy Stardust. Perhaps a little bit too on the nose as a cover. But this album is kind of interesting because it's so pretentious. The second side has this triptych called The Three Shadows. Three Shadows, I think. Is it Three Shadows? It's called
Three Shadows.
Three Shadows. Thank you, research assistant. A lovely research assistant, Rob, there has confirmed that. I wasn't making a schoolboy error. The Three Shadows. It's none more pretentious, isn't it?
Well, we were talking earlier about how Duran Duran Culture Club, that on one level, the excess and the glamour is such a massive repudiation of punk that is immediately preceded it. And equally, the levels of pretension that some bands are getting at, the proto-goth pre-4AD. I know 4AD are around this because it's on 4AD.
Well, Birthday Party are on 4AD.
4AD as well, yeah, Cocktails as well,
yeah.
of course. But I'm talking about, when we have Dead Can Dance in the
Oh,
mid-80s.
yes. Yeah, it goes through the roof.
That you can see that level of what some people would see as pompous pretension foreshadowed in this. And it's possibly, as we said on our 1972, ELP had Benny the Bouncer. You don't get that on Dead Can Dance. You don't get that in Bauhaus. This is deadly serious, deadly pompous,
You don't get it
deadly
on
pretentious.
Pornography either.
You don't get it on Pornography,
No.
do you, Benny the Bouncer?
No.
Um,
Or Are You Ready, Eddie?
no, you don't get that.
No.
But
Thank God.
I really like this. I like the atmosphere. Again, not my favourite band, not my favourite album of the year, but I've always liked Bauhaus. And Bela Lugosi's Dead. What a phenomenal piece
Greatest
of music
debut single
that
of
is.
all time.
And I actually have
Along
a
with Spiral.
real
with
soft
New
spot.
Rose by the Damned and Spiral Scratched by Buzzcocks. Carry
real
on.
soft spot for the Peter Murphy solo albums that he made on Beggar's Banquet.
And we love Darley's Car, his collaboration
Darley's
with Mick
Car.
as well.
What an amazing record.
What
I
a
know
pre-
it's hated.
I love it.
I love it.
So pretentious. I love it.
See,
Love
that I would say is a favourite album. I adore it.
Yeah.
So actually, I've got a lot of time for Peter Murphy and Bauhaus, and I like this, and I kind of like the fact that they're just following their instincts wherever those instincts take
Yeah.
them.
I think
and
they were-
be damned.
I think they were quite dysfunctional as a band. Again, their interpersonal thing was pretty compromised, and that comes out in the music. Obviously, they implode pretty soon after this as a band. I think they made one more album, which was even more schizophrenic than this one. So there's that kind of constant friction that you hear pulling in different directions from track to track. But the one thing that unites it all is it's unbelievably pretentious, and all the better for it.
Yes.
The Psychedelic Furs, Forever Now. Produced by Todd Rundgren. Let's start off with a review. I don't know this record. Let's start off by listening to a listener's review of Psychedelic Furs, Forever Now.
Hello, Stephen and Tim. The album I would like to shine a light on from 1982 is the third LP from the Psychedelic Furs, Forever Now. This album employed the production talents of none other than Todd Rundgren and contains some stellar tracks such as Love My Way, President Gas, and the title track. This album is notable among the band's discography for fusing their trademark smoky post-punk bite with a shimmering pop sensibility, no doubt influenced by Rundgren's presence. The end result is something I think really works and stands out amongst their peers. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Peace.
Thank you very much for that review. Todd is like the Leonard Zelig of pop, isn't he? He just
Yeah,
pops
yeah.
up in all these places. Todd Rundgren produced that. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. Todd Rundgren probably produced it. I don't know the record, Tim. Do you
I
know
do.
the-
I really like it, and it's quite, I think, a development from what had preceded it. I mean, I like what they did before as well, but this might be my favourite album because it's the psychedelic furs with more psychedelic colour in parts. I mean, President Gas has got that kind of relentless, dissonant, almost Bowie Scary Monsters quality. There's certainly a Fripp influence on the guitar. Drinking game favourite. Love My Way is, along with Pretty in Pink, my favourite Psychedelic Furs single, and has this lovely little marimba line running through it, which you always credit, in a sense, to Rundgren because it's a production technique that wouldn't have appeared on the earlier albums. And Richard Butler's voice clearly is coming from a place that Bowie had made his own, but Butler does have this kind of smoky, gravelly, personal take on the Bowie style. So yeah, I've always had a soft spot for Psychedelic Furs, and I really like this album. It might be my favourite of theirs.
Thank you to the listener for the review there too, making up for me not having any idea about this record at all. Let's just quickly go through some other records that came out this year in this category. Scritti Politti, Songs to Remember, their first album. Cabaret Voltaire, 2x45. Concert Angels, Fiction. The Clash, Combat Rock. Never been the biggest Clash fan. I love London Calling, but I've never been particularly a fan.
Combat Rock's pretty good, pretty diverse.
I mean, it has some very famous tunes on it, doesn't it? Should I Stay or Should I Go is on this, right?
Yeah,
Rock the
yeah.
Casbah.
Yeah, Rock the Casbah's great.
A Certain Ratio we do love, and they made two albums this year, which in a way, very different records. The beginning of the year they released Sextet, which again is a very dirty, lo-fi kind of industrial funk record,
Yeah.
kind of a continuation of what they were doing on To Each. Has my favourite A Certain Ratio track on it, Knife Slits Water. But then at the end of the year, they released an album that almost sounds like a Level 42 album. Slick, studio orientated jazz funk.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of it. It's a very strange and very swift transition, isn't it?
It is, and
Almost feels like another band, right?
yeah, I mean, Sextet is great. And as we said before, it's almost like if Weather Report had been brought up on Joy Division. There's some strangeness going on. It's post-punk, yet you can see they've got some
Yeah.
jazz and fusion influences. But as you say, there's a dirty DIY atonal
And the voices
quality.
are all sort of out of, off key and
Yeah.
droning and a little bit in the back of the mix. And then suddenly there's this really slick, it's presumably a different singer on
I think so. I
is
think
it
there
Martin
a
Mosscrop
personnel.
that disappears after Sextet?
Could be. I mean, I
Some line-
really, Sextet's great.
Sextet is amazing.
And this one, I think they perfect it later because there's an album from, I think it's 86.
Force.
Called Force.
Yeah.
And I love Force.
Yeah, that's kind of pulling back a little bit of the...
Yeah, because it's really
Experiment.
ambitious. And again, it has, you were talking earlier about what pop used to have, and I guess that, Radiohead also had it. This thing we were talking about, Bohemian Rhapsody and music by John Miles, where you had, and Live and Let Die, these mini symphonies. And there are actually a couple of almost kind of funk pop mini symphonies on Force. And I really like that album. So it sounds great. And there's a couple of, I think it's Mickey Way, is it? There's a couple of sort of more obvious dance and fusion moments, but it's a great album with some ambition. And so I kind of think, as you say, they pull back in some respects by regaining the ambition.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the fact they change. I love the fact they develop. But this particular...
And they still sound good.
within the space of 12 months is a very, very big change. And I think the problem I have with this is not the fact they've changed, but that they've become quite anonymous on the second record in the year. Whereas nothing could be further from the truth on the previous record, Sextet, which we love. Let's talk about Joe Jackson's Night and Day. We were talking earlier, I forget which band it was we were talking about, the band that almost exists outside of the Venn diagram of pop. We were talking about, I think, Dexys, we were saying, almost, but they don't fit anywhere. Joe Jackson, where does he fit? He's bizarre. He's had a really fascinating career. Started out in a sort of post-punk group, became a solo artist, carried on with the post-punk thing, had a couple of big hits as a post-punker. Is She Really Going Out With Him? Reinvented himself as almost like this jazzer,
Yeah, Joe Jackson, Jumpin' Jive.
made a big band record, and now makes serious classical music. What an amazing career.
He did have very, very diverse tastes. So I
Clearly.
think he's classically trained, played in lots of pub bands in Portsmouth. He was obsessed for a while with Keith Emerson and ELP, so he has all of this in his DNA. I think he was well aware of, as we know from Jumpin' Jive, 20s and 30s big band jazz. So he had a lot in his armory, and yeah, I like him because he's wayward. And there's one album I think he did in the mid '90s where it's got a kind of Mitchell Froome griminess to the production, but it's a concept album called Heaven and Hell, and you can hear lots of.
Let's
Might
talk-
not be Heaven and Hell. The title might be something different.
Let's talk about this album, Night and Day, which sounds a bit like Heaven and Hell, but Night and Day, this is the album he released this year, which is an album, obviously had a massive, massive hit on it in Stepping Out. It's an album of kind of smooth jazz, very slick influence, but very American sounding. And of course, it was a very big hit in America. He was briefly part of the so-called, second British invasion, that included bands like Tears for Fears as well. This was a massive hit in America. The video is all shot in America. It looks very American. It's him kind of playing, and he's in his late 20s, and he's kind of he's almost prematurely balding already. He's the anti-pop star in many ways. He has the image of an anti-pop star. So many ways he was kind of an outlier. He was outside of anything that was going on. But this record was obviously a very, very successful record. Night and Day, and probably I can imagine being embraced by the sort of coffee table people. People just want a record to play in their cocktail party. It's got that sort of degree of accessibility. You can imagine it being played alongside a Steely Dan record.
I was about to say, I think
Rumours.
Gaucho, Asia, and Donald Fagen's Nightfly are the three I can sort of connect
this
with
could completely go in that.
And it's nothing. And
It's nothing like those, no.
Yeah, but what's fascinating is it's then nothing like Jumpin' Jive. And when he emerges on the scene, he's almost a bit like, you have the Elvis Costello, Graham Parker and the Rumour, and Joe Jackson.
Yeah,
because
pub
he
rockers.
fits in with that
sort of
really
post-punk
well.
and it's almost like Joe Jackson. We don't talk about Joe Jackson because he never kind of belonged to anything in particular. In some ways, that does him a disservice that we don't talk enough about Joe Jackson. He's had a very interesting career, and I'm sure he's had, by choice, he's had the career he wanted, being able to sort of be a magpie and just sort of move from one genre to the other.
And I think in Stepping Out and this album, he made enough to secure the rest of his career, probably.
I suspect so. I think it was a very big hit. Let's talk about Felt and Lawrence. The debut album by Felt, Crumbling the Antiseptic Beauty, this year. Felt. Now, famously, Lawrence decided that Felt were going to make 10 albums and 10 singles in 10 years, and then they were going to break up. And that's exactly what he did. Stuck to his guns. And even within that 10 years, Felt made many different kinds of music. This first record is half instrumental, half vocal. What I love about Lawrence is he never seems to hit a single note in tune, but it never sounds out of tune. It's almost like because every note is out of tune, you don't notice that it's out of tune. Do you know what I mean? I love Felt. I mean, gorgeous kind of atmospheric, lo-fi, a bit gothic, a bit Cocteau-y in places. They had a great guitar player. Rob, my beautiful assistant. What was the name of the guitar player on Felt? Morris D-Bank, yes. Lovely style, very, a little bit Robin Guthrie-esque in a way. All the guitar sounds have this sort of trail of reverb to them. So there's a lot of space and ambience to the music. And then Lawrence, what an eccentric. Let's hear a listener review of Felt's first album.
Hey guys, my name is Javier Jones from Medellin, Colombia. My pick for 1982 is Crumbling the Antiseptic Beauty by Felt. Perhaps the charm of this album lies mainly in the simplicity and at times the innocent rawness of the sound. However, when you add the band's dreamy post-punk nature and Lawrence's captivating voice, it slowly builds a haunting and somber contrast that for me makes it a fascinating album for that year. Love the podcast, Javier.
A much more articulate exploration of the album than I gave. Yes, I mean, there is a sense of space about the album. There's very little going on. Sometimes the drums are just hitting the tom. The guitars are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then Lawrence's very peculiar, out of tune drawl, which kind of just sucks you in.
But it's odd, isn't it, that they were known for these elaborate titles, beautiful album covers, and as you say, you could almost
Yeah.
put them as like a DIY 4AD band in a sense. And of course, they did Primitive Painters, did they not, with Elizabeth
Yeah.
Fraser?
Yeah. Produced by
But
Robin Guthrie, yeah.
what's interesting is what he became, Denim, which was the
Yeah.
polar opposite of this.
Yeah.
So he's clearly a maverick.
But even within the Felt catalogue, those first 10 albums, there's one album called Train Above the City, which is an album of vibraphone and electric piano instrumentals, cocktail jazz.
Yeah.
What a bizarre, almost to the level of performance art, you know.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're going to get with the next Felt record. And I like that about Lawrence. I mean, someone who clearly is not career-minded at all, but this album has a very haunting spectral beauty to it.
And I love that title, Crumbling the Antiseptic
Amazing.
Beauty. What a
Amazing.
great title.
Yeah, they had some great titles. Let the Snakes Crinkle Their Heads to Death, which apparently Bobby Gillespie advised Lawrence was the worst album title in history. Right, Orange Juice. 2 albums this year, Tim. I know very little about this band except Rip It Up, that's the big hit. You Can't Hide Your Love Forever. What can you tell us about Orange Juice, Tim? Not much by the sound of it.
No, look, I've got to Rip It Up and love it.
Oh, well, tell us about it then. What do you love about it?
What do I love about it? I think, as I said before, with that Haircut 100, there was a weird subgenre, kind of that postcard approach of this joyous, intelligent pop music that drew from funk. But Orange Juice were always that bit more experimental as well. You know, he was a great guitarist, Colin, so there'd be some interesting solos. They also had a really interesting rhythm section. And they produced a couple of killer pop singles. And of the 2 albums, Rip It Up is the one that I would play more often.
He's got a voice that you have to learn to love, hasn't he?
I suppose so, yeah.
It's bizarre. I mean, I quite like it, don't get me wrong, but I can imagine for a lot of people, Reeves and Mortimer famously took the piss out of him on Shooting Stars.
Yeah.
They do their club singer spot where they do a song in the style of a club singer. And they did Never Known a Girl Like You Before, is that the song? And then you had Mark Lamar saying, it doesn't sound anything like that song. And then they get Edwin Collins actually comes out and he does it. It's brilliant.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Anyway, a few other albums that came out this year in the post-punk fallout. The Sound's 3rd album, All Fall Down. I like the Sound, but we've talked about it before. Killing Joke's 3rd album, Revelations. We love Killing Joke. We talked about Nighttime, I think we talked about as a favourite of ours. The Fall, Hex Education Hour, isn't it called?
Induction.
Isn't it called? You've written Hex Education
No,
Hour.
it wouldn't be me.
It's just spelling mistakes.
That's the MacBook that's done that. It's spelled correct. Induction Hour.
Hex Induction Hour, yeah. That could have been a terrible schoolboy error if we haven't done
Except it wasn't. It's Apple. Blame Steve Jobs.
The Fall, Hex Induction Hour. I love the Fall. I've never been particularly fond of this era. I know that for some people this is the era they love the most, Perverted by Language, Hex Induction Hour. I love things like Grotesque, the Slate CP, and then I love the Beggars Banquet era. I love that era. Curious Orange.
There's some good ones there, I agree.
Yeah, I love that. Friends Experiment, love that. This era, I find the Fall a little bit impenetrable, a little bit cold. I don't necessarily warm to them. Are you a fan, Tim?
I find it interesting. No, I like it.
It's definitely interesting.
I find it interesting.
Yeah.
I like it. Probably like you, actually, the period I most enjoyed was when they signed to Beggars Banquet and they were doing the Orange, I Am Curious Orange, etc.
I love those records. Friends Experiment, I'm Curious Orange. Yeah.
So that's my favourite period of the Fall.
Basically when Bricks is
I suppose
a big part of it, yeah.
But I like these. I do like them, and I like the covers as well.
I mean, the one thing you can say about the Fall is they always sound like the Fall, don't they?
It is true.
Which is to say they sound like nothing else. You talk about outliers in the Venn diagram. I mean, they are.
Yeah.
They are. Right, one more album in this category, Tim, which I'd like to throw in. Thompson Twins, Set. Mm-hmm. This is the album I was trying to remember earlier that Thomas Dolby is all over. Thomas Dolby guests on keyboards, produced by Steve Lillywhite. Mm-hmm. If you listen to this album, now everyone knows Thompson Twins, big hits, Hold Me Now, Doctor Doctor, all those songs. Yep. This is their second record when they were still a band. And they've come out of the sort of squatter, punk rock scene. And I listened to this record for the first time in a long time. I listened to it when I was a kid because I was a big fan of like the pop stuff, and I went back and it didn't compute with me because it sounded like a completely different band. Of course, it is a completely different band. This is the closest comparison I can think of to an English equivalent to Talking Heads at the time.
Okay, yeah.
A lot of that sort of very taut, funky, almost world music influenced rhythm tracks with a very kind of hysterical kind of vocal approach over the top, but these great hooks. I hear elements of 23 Skidoo, I hear elements of Shriekback, I hear elements of the Slits, there's reggae, there's funk, there's world music, there's post-punk. Really fascinating. I'm not going to say it's great, because it's not the sum of its parts ultimately, but very interesting record.
I don't know. I only know the hits. I mean, I knew of their reputation that they were seen as quite arty and a collective.
Very arty. Collective, that's the word. Yeah.
And I didn't mind the hits, and I could see, you can hear in the hits that they've come from an interesting background.
Well, there is one hit, In the Name of Love, In the Name of Love. So that's on this record. And I think once they had that hit, they're like, this is what we should be doing. Or Tom Bailey and Alana Curry, like, this is what we should be doing. Let's fire the rest of the band and just go. So they kind of took that as their template, and obviously worked out very well for them. But here it was kind of the anomaly on this record. That's a very punk-funk record. I mean, it's got more in common with a certain ratio than it does with Duran Duran at this point. Which, again, if you think about where they were 2 or 3 years later, it's almost hard to equate the two things.
Well, it's like Blancmange began in a slightly more Talking Heads rhythmic way as well, and I think Rupert Hine connected to something else, didn't he? He produced one of the later Thompson Twins albums.
Could be. Noel Rodgers produced a record for them. Yeah, I think maybe Close to the Bone he produced. I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyway, that's just an interest. And Thomas Dolby is the connecting factor there.